Chapter 1: The Weight of Distance. Anna and Gabriel had known each other for as long as they could remember. Their childhoods had been intertwined in a way that made it seem inevitable they would always be part of each other's lives. In their quiet, sun-drenched town, where the roads were more often traveled by bicycles than cars, and where everyone knew everyone else's name, they had grown up as neighbors, playmates, and closest friends. Their connection was seamless, something neither of them had ever questioned because it felt as natural as breathing. The fields of golden wheat that surrounded their town seemed to stretch forever, mirroring the boundless possibilities that their younger selves once imagined. They would spend long summer afternoons lying on their backs in those fields, staring up at the sky, making shapes out of clouds, and talking about everything and nothing. Their laughter filled the open air, carried by the breeze, and it was in those moments of shared silence or laughter that something deeper formed between them, something they never named but always knew was there. Their families were as close as their friendship. Sunday dinners at either Anna's or Gabriel's home were a tradition neither family ever broke, with tables laden with home-cooked meals, the air thick with the warmth of shared stories and the smell of fresh bread. Holiday traditions, too, were shared between them, with Christmases that blended gifts and laughter, and Easters filled with egg hunts that lasted all day. Their lives, for so long, had been bound together by the routines of their families and the deep roots they had put down in the same soil. But as they neared the end of high school, life began to shift in a way neither of them could stop. Anna had always been ambitious, a dreamer with a passion for learning. Her teachers encouraged her to reach for something beyond the horizon of their small town, and Anna, who had always imagined herself doing something meaningful, found herself drawn to the city. The opportunity to study education in a university, to become a teacher and help shape the minds of future generations, felt like a calling she couldn't ignore. Gabriel, on the other hand, was tethered to something else. He had a quieter, more grounded dream. His family's farm was small, but it was the heart of his world, passed down through generations. His love for the land, for the way the seasons dictated the rhythm of his life, was something deep and unspoken. He had no desire to leave. The fields that surrounded their town were as much a part of him as his own skin. And so, when Anna talked about leaving, Gabriel listened, always with a half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, but he never asked her to stay. They didn't have a fight or a dramatic parting. When Anna left for the city, it was with the mutual understanding that their paths were diverging, but not necessarily forever. They promised to stay in touch, to visit on weekends, to keep what they had built alive. But life, as it often does, got in the way. At first, they tried. The phone calls were frequent in those early months. Anna would call Gabriel in the evenings, describing her new life in the city with excitement, the people she was meeting, the classes she was taking, the late nights spent studying in cafes. Gabriel, for his part, shared stories of home, of the latest challenges on the farm, of the changing seasons and the way the wheat was coming in. But as time went on, those calls became shorter, less frequent. The distance between them was no longer just physical, it was emotional, growing with each passing day. Gabriel stayed rooted in his routines, finding solace in the rhythm of the farm. His hands worked the land that his father and grandfather had worked before him, and though the days were long and the work was hard, he felt a certain peace in it. But no matter how much time passed, something was missing. Every time he walked down to the lake where they used to spend hours talking, where they once carved their initials into the wooden bench by the shore, he felt the weight of her absence. Anna, too, found success in the city. She flourished as a student, eventually becoming a teacher who was loved by her students and respected by her peers. Her life in the city was full of dinners with friends, long weekends exploring new places, and the satisfaction of a career that fulfilled her. But there was always something gnawing at the edges of her happiness, a quiet whisper in the back of her mind that reminded her of the life she had left behind. Years went by. The texts between them became sporadic, and when they did come, they were filled with pleasantries rather than the deep conversations they once shared. There was an unspoken acknowledgement that something had shifted, that the bond they had was still there but had faded, its edges frayed by time and distance. Then, one autumn evening, Anna received the call that would pull her back to the life she thought she had left behind. Her father had fallen ill, nothing sudden, but serious enough that she needed to return home to help care for him. The city, with all its noise and excitement, suddenly felt far less important. She packed her bags and drove through the night, the familiar landscape of her hometown unfolding before her as she got closer. As she drove through the winding country roads, the golden fields of wheat now touched with the auburn hues of autumn, memories came flooding back. She remembered the sound of Gabriel's laughter as they ran through those fields, the feel of the warm earth beneath their bare feet, and the way the setting sun had always seemed to cast everything in a golden glow. She remembered their late-night talks under the stars, when the world felt small and they were the only two people in it. And she remembered the way they never quite said what they meant, the way their feelings for each other had always hovered on the edge of something more, but had never crossed that line. When she pulled up to her family home, it looked the same, yet different. The house had aged in her absence, just as she had. Her father, once strong and full of life, now looked frail and worn, and her mother's face was lined with worry. Stepping inside, Anna felt the weight of her responsibility settle onto her shoulders. She had no choice but to put her life on pause and take care of the family that had always taken care of her. It was Gabriel who appeared at her door that evening, as though no time had passed at all. He had heard about her father, of course. News traveled fast in their small town. When she opened the door and saw him standing there, her breath caught in her throat. His face was more worn, his eyes a little more tired, but the kindness in them was the same. Without a word, they embraced, and in that moment, the years of distance and silence melted away. But even as they stood there, holding on to each other, neither of them knew how to begin talking about the feelings they had buried. So much time had passed, and so much had been left unsaid. The bond between them had never been broken, but it had been stretched thin, like a thread that might snap if pulled too hard. And yet, in that moment, they both felt it of an undeniable connection that had survived the weight of distance, waiting for the right moment to be rediscovered. Chapter 2: The Unspoken Words. The following weeks unfolded in a haze for Anna. The days bled into nights, and time lost its meaning. Hospital visits became routine, a series of quiet drives to and from the sterile, whitewashed walls where her father lay, frailer by the day. She could see the fight slipping from him, his once strong hands now trembling as he reached for hers. His voice, once full of life, had grown soft, his words coming out in barely audible whispers, though the warmth of his presence was still there in his eyes. Her mother had passed away years before, leaving Anna as the only child to bear the weight of her father's care. The grief from that loss resurfaced in new waves, layering upon the fresh sorrow of watching her father fade. And with no siblings to share the burden, Anna felt the crushing responsibility pressing down on her. She had to hold everything together, manage the house, keep track of medical appointments, and deal with the inevitable paperwork that came with serious illness. She was overwhelmed but didn't allow herself to show it. She couldn't afford to crumble, not now. Gabriel, in his quiet, unobtrusive way, became her anchor. He never made grand gestures, never pushed her to talk about what she was going through, but he was always there. He brought vegetables from his farm, fresh milk, and eggs, dropping them off with little fanfare as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And each time he left, there was something else: wood chopped for the fireplace, the lawn neatly trimmed, small repairs around the house done without a word of acknowledgement. Their interactions had become a rhythm, a pattern that felt both comforting and painful. They had fallen into the same familiarity they had once shared in their youth. Anna would watch as Gabriel fixed a broken step on the porch or stacked firewood, his presence solid and reassuring, but beneath it all was the tension they had both learned to avoid acknowledging. The unspoken words lingered between them, thickening the air around them like an invisible thread connecting their hearts yet holding them apart. It wasn't that they didn't know how to talk to each other, they had spent their entire childhoods doing just that. But the stakes felt higher now. They weren't the same carefree teenagers who could spend hours talking about dreams without ever worrying about the future. Time had passed. Life had happened. They had lived separate lives, forged different paths, and made choices they couldn't undo. Now, the weight of those years hung heavy between them, and neither knew how to bridge the distance that had formed, not just the physical distance, but the emotional gulf that had widened over the years of silence. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day spent at the hospital, Anna needed a break from the overwhelming grief and stress that clung to her. She slipped out of the house as dusk began to fall, her feet carrying her almost instinctively to the lake where she and Gabriel had spent so many afternoons as teenagers. The air was cool, tinged with the scent of wet earth and the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. The lake stretched before her, a mirror of stillness, reflecting the soft hues of the setting sun, a palette of purples, pinks, and golds that painted the sky and water alike. Anna sat on the old, worn-out bench that faced the lake, the same bench where, so many years ago, she and Gabriel had carved their initials into the wood. She ran her fingers over the faded carvings, tracing the letters as memories washed over her. This place, this moment, felt like a refuge from the chaos her life had become. But it was also a reminder of everything she and Gabriel had never said to each other. The dreams they had never shared, the feelings they had always pushed aside. She wasn't surprised when Gabriel appeared beside her a few moments later. He had always known her better than anyone, and he could still read her, even after all this time. His arrival felt natural, as if they had slipped back into the past, back to the days when they knew each other's thoughts before they spoke them. He didn't ask if he could sit, he simply lowered himself onto the bench beside her, the wooden slats creaking softly beneath his weight. "You always come here when you need to think," he said, his voice low and familiar. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. He knew this about her. Anna kept her gaze on the lake, her eyes tracing the way the last of the sunlight danced on the water's surface. "Yeah," she whispered, her voice heavy with exhaustion and the weight of everything she hadn't said. "It's the only place that feels still." They sat in silence for a while, the sound of the wind in the trees and the distant call of a bird the only interruptions. It was a comfortable silence, but it was filled with the unspoken tension that had always lingered between them. Anna could feel Gabriel's presence beside her, solid, familiar, and comforting. But she could also feel the space between them, the years of distance that had stretched their bond thin. "I've been thinking a lot," Anna finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. She glanced at Gabriel, her heart racing as she prepared to give voice to the thoughts that had been circling in her mind since she'd returned. "About us. About what we could have been, but I'm not sure we're the same people anymore." Her words hung in the air between them, heavy and raw. She didn't know what she was expecting, some grand revelation, some sudden clarity about their past and future. But all she felt was the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her chest. She didn't know if she was ready for whatever answer Gabriel might give. Gabriel sighed softly, his hands resting in his lap, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Maybe we've changed," he said slowly, as if choosing his words carefully. "But that doesn't mean what we had wasn't real." He paused, turning to look at her, his expression soft but unreadable. "You're here now, and I'm here. Isn't that something?" Anna swallowed hard, the truth of his words settling into her. They were here. After all the years, after everything that had happened, they had found their way back to each other. But was it enough? Could they rebuild something that had never been fully realized in the first place? Before she could answer, life once again intervened. In the days that followed, her father's health took a sharp decline. The hospital visits grew longer, the nights even more sleepless, and the weight of impending loss settled over Anna like a heavy shroud. Grief began to seep into every corner of her life, and the idea of thinking about anything else, about her feelings for Gabriel, about the future, about herself, became impossible. Through it all, Gabriel remained steadfast. He was there every day, sometimes just sitting quietly with her in the hospital, offering no words but a steady presence. Other times, he took care of things at home, bringing meals, tending to the garden, and even dealing with the small but overwhelming tasks that piled up in the wake of her father's worsening condition. He never asked for anything in return, never demanded that she talk about her feelings or confront the growing tension between them. He was simply there, a quiet, unwavering support in the middle of the storm. When the inevitable happened, and her father finally passed, it felt as though Anna's world collapsed around her. The grief was so intense, so all-consuming, that she wasn't sure she could bear it. But through it all, Gabriel was the one constant, the one thing she could hold onto when everything else felt like it was falling apart. The funeral was a small, intimate affair, with close family and friends gathered to say their final goodbyes. Anna stood at the edge of the cemetery, watching as they lowered her father's casket into the ground, her heart heavy with grief. She felt like she was floating, detached from the world, as though her emotions had become too much to process. But as she stood there, Gabriel came to her side, slipping his hand into hers. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His presence was enough, a steadying force that anchored her to the moment, to the here and now. And in that quiet, shared silence, Anna realized something that had been eluding her for weeks. Gabriel had been there for her in every way that mattered. He had been her rock, her support, her anchor through the hardest moments of her life. And perhaps, that was the unspoken truth between them, that love, real love, wasn't always about grand gestures or passionate declarations. Sometimes, it was about simply being there, holding each other up when the world felt like too much. As they stood together by the lake that evening, the fading light casting long shadows over the water, Anna understood that, while they had changed, their bond had not. It had weathered the storms of time, distance, and unspoken words. And now, it was up to them to decide what to do with it. Chapter 3: Love Finds Its Way. The funeral passed in a blur of soft whispers, rustling leaves, and muted sobs. Anna stood at the edge of the cemetery, feeling the weight of her father's loss bear down on her, yet something else lingered within her, a sense of clarity, a truth she had been avoiding for far too long. Grief had hollowed her out, left her raw and vulnerable, but it had also cleared away the distractions, revealing what was left standing at the heart of her life. Gabriel. Always Gabriel. She watched him from a distance as he helped her father's old friends gather, his strong, familiar presence a comforting constant in the swirl of sorrow. He moved with quiet purpose, his actions small yet meaningful, an extra chair for an elderly neighbor, a steady hand on the shoulder of an old friend. He had been there through every difficult moment, not as someone seeking recognition or approval, but as someone who had always belonged. In the weeks that followed, the world around Anna changed, yet it also remained the same. Her father's absence echoed in every corner of the house, in the creaking of the old floorboards, in the garden that had once been his pride and joy. The family home, once vibrant and full of life, now felt subdued, quieter in a way that weighed on her heart. Yet within the quiet, Anna found herself drawn into a new routine, one filled with small acts of care. She tended to the garden her father had left behind, preserving it as a tribute to him, and handled the endless paperwork that followed his passing. The city life she had once known, with its bustling streets, crowded classrooms, and endless demands, felt distant now, like a faint echo of someone else's story. Anna had expected to feel a pull back to that life, to return to the familiar comfort of her teaching job, her apartment, her friends. But as the days passed, the tug of the city faded, replaced by something deeper, something she hadn't anticipated, a desire to stay. Not out of obligation, but out of a quiet understanding that this small town, with its rolling fields and golden sunsets, was where she truly belonged. Gabriel continued to be a constant presence. He didn't press her with questions or pry into her grief, he simply showed up. He was there to help with the heavier tasks around the house, fixing a broken fence, mending a leaking roof, tending to the crops her father had left behind. His visits were never planned, yet he always seemed to arrive when Anna needed him most. They fell into a comfortable silence together, sharing the burden of loss in a way that needed no explanation. One evening, as the warmth of the day began to slip into the cool embrace of night, Anna sat on the front porch of the house, her gaze fixed on the fading horizon. The crickets chirped softly in the distance, and the sky was painted in deep purples and golds. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the faint fragrance of wildflowers that lined the fields. Gabriel sat beside her, the wooden porch creaking under his weight as he leaned back, his hands resting on his knees. They had shared so many quiet moments like this, moments where words felt unnecessary, where the weight of their shared history was enough. But this evening was different. The silence between them felt heavier, filled with all the things they had left unsaid for too long. Anna could feel her heart racing, her palms damp with nerves. She had been running from this conversation for years, avoiding the feelings that had always been there but had seemed too complicated to untangle. Finally, she broke the silence, her voice soft and trembling. "I don't know where I go from here," she began, her eyes still fixed on the horizon, afraid to look at him just yet. "Everything's changed, and I feel lost." She paused, swallowing the lump in her throat. "But I know one thing for sure, I don't want to lose you again, Gabriel." The words were out, and with them, a rush of relief and vulnerability. She had carried that weight for so long, unsure of how to express the depth of her feelings without reopening old wounds or complicating their already fragile relationship. Gabriel turned to her, his expression soft, his eyes filled with something she hadn't dared to hope for: love, patience, and understanding. He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers gently intertwining with hers. "You never lost me, Anna," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I've always been here, waiting." Those words, so simple and yet so profound, unraveled something deep inside her. Tears welled in her eyes, not out of sadness, but out of a profound sense of peace, of belonging. For the first time in years, Anna felt like she didn't have to run anymore. She didn't have to keep building walls around her heart or pretend that the love she had felt for Gabriel was anything less than real. "I love you," she whispered, the words escaping her lips before she could second-guess them. They had always been there, just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to be spoken aloud. Gabriel's lips curved into a gentle smile, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "I love you too," he replied softly, his eyes never leaving hers. There was no dramatic declaration, no sweeping gesture of romance. It was quiet, understated, and exactly what they needed. Their love had never been about grand displays or passionate speeches. It had always been about the quiet moments, the unspoken connection that had bound them together from the start. It was the kind of love that endured, the kind that weathered the storms of time, distance, and silence. In the months that followed, Anna made a decision that surprised her. She chose to stay. The city, with its bright lights and fast pace, no longer held the same appeal. What mattered now was here, her family home, the small town that had shaped her, and the man she had loved all along. Together, she and Gabriel began to rebuild, not just the physical aspects of the house and farm, but their lives. They took it slow, allowing themselves to relearn each other, to discover who they had become in the years they had spent apart. There were challenges, of course. Life wasn't as simple as it had been when they were teenagers, but they faced those challenges together, side by side. Anna took on part-time work at the local school, while Gabriel expanded the farm, finding joy in the simplicity of the land. They built a life that was theirs, full of small moments of joy, quiet evenings by the fire, and shared dreams that had once seemed so distant. As the seasons changed, so did they. Their love deepened, growing stronger with each passing day. And though life was not without its hardships, they faced them with the quiet strength of two people who had been through the worst and come out the other side, hand in hand. One evening, as they sat on the porch together, watching the sunset over the fields, Anna leaned her head on Gabriel's shoulder, feeling the warmth of his body next to hers. The sky was awash in hues of orange and pink, the same colors that had once painted the lake where they had spent so many afternoons together as teenagers. "Do you think we were always meant to end up here?" Anna asked, her voice soft and full of wonder. Gabriel smiled, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I don't know if it was fate," he replied, "but I do know that love has a way of finding its place, even when life tries to pull you apart." And as they sat there, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, Anna knew he was right. Love had found its way back to them, through time, through distance, through silence. And in the end, it was all that mattered.